Hey guys! Tonight, we slip into the smoke and rubble just after World War II. Picture it: shattered cities, half-buried tanks, rusting in the mud, and two exhausted victors, America and the Soviet Union, staring across the wreckage, like roommates who just found out they hate each other's music. You can almost hear the dust settle on the ruins of Berlin as soldiers pack up, refugees shuffle westward, and new battle lines draw themselves across maps that are still warm from being redrawn. You, meanwhile, are dragging your boots through the ruins of a European rail yard. The air smells like ash, wet cement, and old diesel fuel. You pass walls still scrawled with desperate messages. Hans was here? Don't shoot, we're civilians. And the occasional bullet hole punctuation. The war is over technically. But what's beginning now? That's a different kind of storm. One without trenches, but with a whole lot of tension. This is the moment the Cold War starts to simmer. Quietly. No declarations, no parades. Just a steady frost creeping into diplomacy. The Americans and the Soviets, fresh off their unlikely alliance, are already glancing at each other sideways. One holding a briefcase, the other a bayonet. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. Are you a night owl in New York? Or just waking up in Manila? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The war's barely ended, and already you feel it? A chill in the air, not from the weather, but from the way the Americans and Soviets eye each other at every train station, every border checkpoint. They just fought together to bring down Hitler, sure, but you could already sense this was never going to be a warm friendship. In 1945, the Allies had emerged victorious, but their unity was purely transactional. The US, with its booming industry untouched by war at home, rolled into Europe with fresh uniforms and jazz records. The Soviet Union, by contrast, had clawed its way to victory through scorched earth, 20 million dead, and a trauma that would hang in its political air for generations. They both wanted a safer world, just very different versions of what that meant. And in that ideological standoff, there you are, standing between the East and West, as tanks roll out, but suspicions roll in. At the Yalta Conference that February, before the war even ended, Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin met like three poker players, trying to split the pot before the cards were shown. The conversation? Europe's future. And like every group project ever, someone would definitely walk away feeling cheated. Roosevelt hoped for the spread of democracy and free markets. Stalin, he wanted buffer zones, friendly governments that wouldn't stab him in the back like Nazi Germany did. And Churchill mostly wanted to hang on to Britain's global influence, though he'd soon be voted out of office. The trio posed for photographs, like best pals. But underneath that diplomatic grin, you could already sense it. Nobody trusted each other. You're in Berlin now, not the cool, gritty city of techno and street art, but the 1945 version. A gutted husk, silent, except for the crunch of boots on broken glass. The city is divided into 4 zones, each controlled by an ally: America, Britain, France, and the USSR. You can walk 5 minutes and hear 4 languages. One moment, you're offered chewing gum by a smiling GI. The next, you're ordered to stoy by a Soviet soldier holding a Mosin Nagant. Mainstream historical fact? The Cold War began before the last gunshots of World War II had even stopped echoing. The Soviet Union began installing communist regimes across Eastern Europe, starting with Poland. Western leaders, especially Churchill, were alarmed. By the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, tensions had sharpened. Truman had taken over after FDR's death, and he wasn't keen on appeasement. In fact, during the meeting, Truman casually mentioned to Stalin that the US had developed a new weapon of unusual destructive force. He was referring to the atomic bomb. Stalin, to his credit, didn't blink. Not because he wasn't shocked, but because his spies had already told him everything. He knew about the Manhattan Project before most American senators did. Quirky fact: Klaus Fuchs, a key scientist in the bomb's development, passed secrets to the Soviets from within the project itself. Yeah, Cold War espionage began before the war it's named after even started. Historians still argue whether Truman's atomic name drop at Potsdam was a genuine attempt to keep the peace or a strategic flex that accelerated the arms race. Either way, the message was clear. We've got something terrifying, and we're not afraid to use it. And sure enough, on August 6th and 9th, the bombs dropped. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world changed in a flash of light, and Stalin's urgency to catch up multiplied tenfold. The nuclear age had arrived, and with it, a new kind of fear. Less trench foot, more existential dread. Back in Europe, things weren't settling. They were hardening. The Soviets moved quickly to install communist governments in East Germany, Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary. These weren't exactly democratic transitions, more like guided tours to the far left, hosted by guys with red flags and very little chill. Meanwhile, the US ramped up what would later be called containment. The idea? Don't roll back communism, just make sure it doesn't spread. The tool? Money. Enter the Marshall Plan in 1947. You can almost smell the ink on the checks as American aid flowed into war-torn Western Europe. $13 billion in loans, food, machinery, and goodwill. Streets were rebuilt, factories refired, and capitalism got a second wind. But Eastern Europe? Stalin refused all aid, calling it capitalist bribery. The Iron Curtain was already descending, whether Churchill had named it yet or not. Meanwhile, back in the States, paranoia simmered. Not outright panic, not yet, but an unease that would soon burst into full-blown Red Scare mania. But that's for another night. Tonight, your boots crunch through a frostbitten Warsaw morning. You pass by a wall with 2 posters, one with a smiling American offering wheat, the other with a hammer and sickle, both torn, both watched closely by a man in a wool coat who definitely doesn't like questions. You make your way through rubble that feels less like ruins and more like clay, soft, reshaped every month by politics and power. Kids play with helmets they found in the ruins, while shopkeepers hang signs in whatever language gets them food. You're watching the world get carved into 2 ideologies, Freedom versus control. Coke versus vodka. Elvis versus the Bolshoi Ballet. Neither side is innocent. Both are terrified. And both are ready to build walls. Not just in Berlin, but everywhere. Even the military smells different. US GIs eat chocolate and ride in jeeps, while Soviet troops, in heavy coats, march in eerie unison. Red banners fluttering in gray wind. Both sides are heroes to their own people and villains to each other. There is no treaty declaring the Cold War. No speeches or cannon blasts. Just a widening silence between two superpowers, both claiming moral superiority, both locking their doors while smiling politely. And you? You're just trying to keep your socks dry and your head down. But it's not easy, because every alley, every cafe, every newspaper headline whispers the same question. What now? The world may be done with war, but war, it seems, isn't done with the world. So, you're walking down a cracked cobblestone street somewhere in war-shattered Europe, maybe Vienna or Budapest or the edge of Berlin. The air smells of coal smoke and cabbage stew, and every time someone closes a wooden door too hard, you flinch like it's an air raid siren. The war is technically over, but something heavier than rubble is pressing down on the cities. In the distance, a British voice cuts through the static of a battered radio. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Winston Churchill has just dropped a phrase that's going to haunt global politics for the next 40 years. The Iron Curtain. And while it's metaphorical, it might as well be an actual wall for how divided the world is about to become. You sip lukewarm coffee at a train station cafe. The sugar is gone, rationed, or just vanished into black market deals. But the bitterness tastes familiar. The American newspapers say freedom is on the march. Soviet papers say fascism is regrouping under the stars and stripes. You're in the middle, a civilian with too much history on your coat sleeves. That Iron Curtain speech? It happened in March 1946 in Fulton, Missouri, of all places. Churchill wasn't even prime minister anymore, but there he was, standing beside President Truman like a man with unfinished business. And what he said out loud, the whole world had already started to whisper. He wasn't just describing borders. He was marking out camps. The world was now a divided chessboard, and both kings were staring each other down before even moving a pawn. Mainstream historical fact. That speech didn't start the Cold War. It just put a name to what had already begun. Stalin, unsurprisingly, hated it, called Churchill a warmonger, accused the West of being just as imperialistic as the old czars. The Soviet press raged, and propaganda machines on both sides roared into life. A quirky little side note: Churchill's speech wasn't supposed to be some fiery geopolitical gauntlet. He thought he was delivering a friendly warning. In fact, he wanted the West to stay united against future wars. But Iron Curtain hit a nerve, and the phrase stuck like wet cement. And historians still argue whether Churchill's speech hardened the Cold War or simply described it. Some say he drew the line, others say he merely outlined what was already happening in Poland Romania, and Hungary. One thing's for sure. Once the term hit the headlines, there was no going back. You're now looking at maps again. Not the old wartime ones, with tank routes and landing zones, but new ones, quietly redrawn borders, zones of influence. The Soviets tightened their grip on Eastern Europe with puppet governments dressed in just enough local flair to keep up appearances. The West begins to rally around a different idea. Stop communism at the source. And then there's Germany, the awkward, split-level apartment, where the two new worldviews are forced to share space. The East is draped in red, the West wrapped in blue. Berlin itself becomes a symbol of everything that's coming. A city carved up like a Thanksgiving turkey, each piece guarded like a nuclear secret. Meanwhile, back in America, Truman's doctrine is hatching. His belief is simple: support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation. Doesn't say communism out loud, but everyone knows what's between the lines. It's March 1947 when he makes it official, pledging aid to Greece and Turkey. And with that, America steps into the Cold War, not just as a participant, but as a global landlord. You hitch a ride in a Jeep along a muddy Yugoslav road. Tito's partisans have taken control, and though they wear communist stars, Tito isn't exactly Stalin's pet. There's tension, even among allies, proof that the communist bloc isn't the monolith people think. You listen to two locals argue whether the Soviets will liberate or dominate. The irony? They're both right. Western Europe starts to look like a patient in recovery, tired but hopeful. Eastern Europe? Less patient, more prisoner. And yet, life pushes forward. People still get married. Children play with toys made from recycled bullet casings. Jazz records make their way through black market tunnels, and propaganda posters become wallpaper to lives that refuse to stand still. By 1948, you hear about something new: the Cominform, a Soviet tool meant to tighten ideological discipline among satellite states. It's a newsletter, a political line, and a leash, all rolled into one. Countries that don't fall in line, they get the cold shoulder, or worse. And as tension hardens, you start noticing that Western nations are pulling closer together, not just diplomatically, but militarily. Whispers of a mutual defense pact buzz through the newspapers. Soon, NATO will be born. But first, the dominoes have to line up. There is a subtle shift happening. You feel it when you talk to soldiers, or diplomats, or even farmers. War isn't coming back in the old way. No invasions or trenches. But nobody trusts anyone. Every handshake hides a dagger, and every embassy feels like a bunker, with good stationery. The line Churchill spoke about, it's more than metaphor. In Hungary, elections are held, and then immediately manipulated. In Czechoslovakia, a coup d'etat installs a communist regime almost overnight in 1948. That one hits hard in the West. Prague was supposed to be a question mark, not a full stop. The result? The West panics. The US Congress, once hesitant about foreign aid, suddenly throws open its wallet. The Marshall Plan kicks into gear, pumping billions into Western Europe. And what's wild is, it works. France, West Germany, Italy, all start to recover faster than expected. Factory lines start humming again. Bread lines shrink. The lights stay on longer. But this prosperity comes at a price. If you're Eastern Bloc, it looks like Western bribery. If you're in the West, it looks like freedom, triumphing over tyranny. If you're you, somewhere in the middle, it just looks like a game where the pieces are countries and nobody asked you to play. The Soviet response? Isolation. They ban Marshall Plan aid in their sphere. Instead, they prop up their own version, COMCON, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. Less money, more slogans. The division hardens in the simplest places. Currency. The West introduces a new Deutschmark in 1948 in its sectors of Germany. The Soviets hate it. They see it as a threat to their control. And Berlin, already split, becomes the front line. But the clash, we'll save it for next time. Tonight, you're sitting in a smoky tavern in Vienna, hearing a Russian accordion compete with an American jazz band 3 doors down. Outside, children chase each other through empty lots that once held buildings. Inside, everyone pretends this new peace will hold, that history won't repeat itself. But as the night deepens and the bartender lowers the radio to hush the static, you can feel it. The Cold War isn't coming. It's already here. You're standing in a city split not just by concrete or ideology, but by silence. Berlin, 1948. You can almost hear the tension crackle beneath your boots. There's no fighting, not in the usual way, but the glances between soldiers on opposite sides of a street feel like loaded rifles. The graffiti on the wall outside your hostel says it best. Freedom in the West, shadows in the East. But you're not sure who wrote it. Could have been a hopeful student or a Western operative with a can of spray paint and a deadline. It all starts with money, as so many fights do. In June 1948, the Western Allies, America, Britain, and France, decide to introduce a new currency in their occupied zones of Germany, the Deutsche Mark. It's crisp, blue, and promising, a symbol of economic recovery. To the Soviets, though, it's a punch in the face. They weren't consulted, and they see it as a clear signal. The West is stitching together West Germany behind their backs. So Stalin slams the gate, literally. On June 24th, 1948, all railways, roads, and canal access into West Berlin, deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, are cut off. A city of more than 2 million people is suddenly stranded, surrounded by a rising red wall of ideology. Trucks blocked, trains halted, barges turned away. Soviet troops stand at checkpoints like bouncers outside a Cold War nightclub. Mainstream historical fact. This is the Berlin blockade, Stalin's first big power play in the Cold War, and the first time the West has to decide if it's willing to fight for a city it technically doesn't even own. And just when it seems like a siege is inevitable, planes appear like flocks of steel geese. Allied cargo aircraft begin touching down on Berlin's runways. First dozens, then hundreds, then over 1,000 flights per day. This is the Berlin airlift, and it's as much a logistical miracle as it is a political one. You're watching from the edge of Tempelhof Airport. A boy beside you clutches a crumpled piece of paper. On it, a drawing of an airplane with candy tied to a handkerchief parachute. His eyes light up when he hears the familiar hum above. He knows what's coming. The pilot is Gail Halverson, soon nicknamed the Candy Bomber, a US pilot who, on a whim, started dropping chocolates attached to tiny parachutes for Berlin's children. His logic? No one can fight a war if they're mad at someone who gives them candy. Quirky fact. Kids began calling him Uncle Wiggly Wings because he'd wiggle the wings of his C-54 just before making a candy drop. By winter, the airlift is a full-blown operation. Coal, flour, medicine, everything needed to keep a city alive arrives via the sky. British and American crews fly around the clock, often landing in fog so thick you can barely see the wingtips. There's a rhythm to it. Land, unload, take off again. Rinse and repeat. Tempelhof, Gatow, and Tegel airports become lifelines. At one point, a plane lands every 30 seconds. Imagine that. Every 30 seconds, a city takes a breath. But not everyone is cheering. Soviet propaganda paints the airlift as aggression disguised as aid. Loudspeakers in East Berlin blare accusations. Leaflets fall like snow, warning Berliners that the West will abandon them any day now. But the days stretch on, then weeks, then months. You're huddled in an apartment in the French sector. The radiator barely works. The power flickers. But outside the frosted window, you see children racing to the edge of a field as another cargo plane dips low. The city isn't dying. It's surviving. And historians still argue whether Stalin ever truly meant for the blockade to escalate into war, or if it was just a test of will, a high-stakes bluff. If it was, it failed, because after nearly 11 months, the Soviets blink. On May 12, 1949, the blockade ends, just like that. Roads open, railways rumble, barges bob along the canals again. Stalin says nothing, but the message is clear. The West didn't break. And just to be sure this doesn't happen again, the US does something major. They shift from "we'll help if we feel like it" to "we'll help no matter what." That same year, NATO is born, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military alliance made up of the US, Canada, and 10 European countries. One attack on any member is considered an attack on all. It's like forming a superhero team, except with tanks instead of capes. The Soviets, predictably, are not invited, and so the line hardens even more. Germany splits in two. Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, forms in May 1949. German Democratic Republic, East Germany, responds in October. Neither side recognizes the other. Berlin, still divided into East and West, becomes a microcosm of the Cold War itself, a place where you can walk from capitalism to communism in 10 minutes, if you're brave or foolish enough. But that line, it's becoming less metaphorical and more physical by the day. Border guards, passports, inspections. You can feel the concrete being poured, even if the wall hasn't been built yet. One evening, You walk to the edge of the Soviet sector. A man tries to cross. He's got family in the West. You hear a whistle, then a shout, then silence. He disappears, just like that. The next day, the newspapers call him a provocateur. His sister says he was just trying to bring soup to his mother. And that's how it goes now. 2 worlds, 2 truths, 1 city. You take a seat on a park bench near the Brandenburg Gate. The lights in the west flicker with jazz bars and cinemas. The east, a duller glow, more uniform, more quiet. The same city, split like a cracked plate. Somewhere nearby, a spy sips tea with a diplomat. A wire is tucked beneath the collar of someone's coat. Kids kick a soccer ball across a checkpoint line and run back laughing. Adults don't laugh. They look over their shoulders. And above all of it, the planes keep coming. The echo of the blockade will last longer than the blockade itself. You lie back, listening to their engines. 1 every 30 seconds. For nearly a year, they kept a city alive, and in doing so, made it clear to Stalin and the world that the Cold War wouldn't be won with a single blockade, or lost with one. It would be a game of endurance, and the players were only just getting started. You wake up in 1950s America, and everything smells like hairspray, coffee, and atomic anxiety. The war is over, the troops are home, but the world feels anything but peaceful. The suburbs are booming, diners are glowing, and everyone's checking under their bed for communists. Welcome to the Red Scare, where paranoia gets a seat at the dinner table, and being un-American could ruin your life faster than a bad haircut. You step into a pastel-tinted kitchen. There's a TV the size of a washing machine humming in the corner, and a magazine spread of a family smiling in front of their new fallout shelter. The dad's holding a shovel. The mom's got a casserole. The message is clear. We may all die in a nuclear war, but at least dinner will be ready on time. It starts quietly. Whispers. A neighbor who doesn't salute the flag with enough enthusiasm. A professor who once visited Moscow for a poetry conference. A librarian who recommends Russian novels. Suddenly, it's not just gossip. It's a witch hunt. The man behind the curtain, Senator Joseph McCarthy from Wisconsin. A man with thick eyebrows, a love of television cameras, and a briefcase allegedly full of communist names. Mainstream historical fact. In 1950, McCarthy claimed he had a list of over 200 communists working in the US government. No one ever saw the list. It was a myth that changed lives. Because facts didn't matter. Fear did. McCarthy wasn't subtle. His speeches dripped with drama. He waved papers around like confetti and accused everyone from low-level clerks to decorated generals. Committees were formed. Hearings were televised. Careers were destroyed. You walk past a newsstand. The headline reads, "Actor refuses to testify." Maybe a red. You pause. It's not about loyalty anymore. It's about survival. In Hollywood, the blacklist becomes an invisible wall. Writers, directors, and actors are cut off from their careers if they're suspected of communist ties, or even if they refuse to name names. And some of the accusations? Downright bizarre. Quirky fact. There were actual government concerns about communists hiding subliminal messages in children's cartoons. The FBI even investigated Superman comic books for potential ideological distortion. Apparently, X-ray vision might be un-American. Historians still argue whether McCarthy was genuinely convinced of a deep conspiracy or simply drunk on power and attention. Some say he believed in the threat. Others call him a master manipulator, riding a wave of fear for political gain. What's undeniable is the damage. People lost jobs, reputations, and peace of mind. The country started watching itself through frosted glass. In schools, kids practice duck and cover drills, like it'll actually help if a nuke drops. You're sitting cross-legged under a desk with your hands over your neck, listening to your teacher calmly explain how a flash brighter than the sun might mean it's time to stay low and stay calm. Not terrifying at all. And back home, there's the bomb shelter brochure on the kitchen table. Families dig holes in the backyard, not for swing sets, but for steel-reinforced bunkers. One ad even promises a built-in radio, canned meat storage, and a family-friendly air filtration system. You know, in case you want to spend the apocalypse breathing filtered despair with the people you love. But the fear doesn't stop at borders. In 1950, the Soviet Union successfully tests its first atomic bomb. The American monopoly on doomsday is over. Suddenly, the Cold War isn't just distant espionage and diplomatic squabbles. It's personal. You could be vaporized before you finish your TV dinner. So the US ramps up. Defense spending spikes. Civilians start volunteering for a ground observer corps, watching the skies with binoculars, hoping to spot Soviet bombers before the sirens wail. There's even a booklet called Survival Under Atomic Attack. Page 1. Don't panic. Good luck with that. The culture shifts. People start dressing conformity and patriotism. If you're different, too loud, too quiet, too artsy, too foreign, you might just be a threat. Families argue over loyalty oaths. Students get expelled for not saluting flags. And if you're a scientist, you're either building bombs or being watched by people who do. All while the government quietly works on something called hydrogen bombs, more powerful than the ones dropped on Japan. Test sites bloom in the deserts, like radioactive cacti, Nevada, Bikini Atoll. You can feel the earth shudder, even if you're half a world away. And yet, daily life carries on. Sock hops, baseball games, backyard BBQs. It's a strange contradiction. Living a normal life with one eye on the mushroom cloud. One night, you visit a bar in Los Angeles. A jazz trio plays something smooth and slow. At the table next to you, a man in a gray suit whispers about a colleague who reads Russian poetry. You don't know if it's a compliment or an accusation. You step outside. The city buzzes beneath the neon glow. Somewhere overhead, the sky looks calm. But you know there are planes up there. Bombers, early warning radars, maybe even a satellite prototype. The Cold War isn't just politics anymore. It's in the air you breathe. And then, like a snap of elastic, it all starts to stretch too far. In 1954, McCarthy finally meets someone he can't bully: the US Army. He accuses it of harboring communists, and the whole circus turns sour. The televised Army McCarthy hearings expose his methods: bluster, accusation, and not much else. The final blow? Attorney Joseph Welch, eyes steady, voice calm. "Have you no sense of decency, sir?" And just like that, the spell breaks. The public starts turning away. McCarthy is censured by the Senate later that year. His reign of fear ends, not with a bang, but with a slow fade. He dies a few years later, politically broken, historically infamous. But the damage, still there. The Red Scare lingers in the wallpaper of the 1950s. It teaches a generation to whisper, to self-censor, to never leave a book lying around if it looks too left. You walk past a theater showing Invasion of the Body Snatchers. It's a movie about aliens, but everyone knows it's really about communists. Even pop culture can't escape the mood. Every story seems to be about infiltration, identity, control, and still, beneath all the suspicion and finger-pointing, the Cold War machine hums on. The Soviets are building faster. The Americans are responding. It's a race without a finish line, and no one wants to blink first. You look up at the sky again. A star? Maybe. A spy plane? Could be. Or maybe it's just the echo of something too big to name. Fear, pride, ideology, all suspended in orbit. Whatever it is, it's watching. And you? You keep moving. Careful. Quiet. Always wondering who's listening. Your shoes crunch on sun-baked dust as you step onto the Korean peninsula, 1950. The air is thick with humidity, diesel, and a kind of tension that feels ancient and brand new all at once. It's a place sliced clean across the middle by an invisible line, the 38th parallel. On one side, Soviet-backed North Korea, all stern discipline and Kim Il-sung portraits. On the other, American-sponsored South Korea, trying to find its footing with jazz records and rice paddies. But there's no time for subtlety now, because war is coming fast, and no one's entirely sure who blinked first. It starts like a lightning crack on June 25th, 1950. North Korean troops, tanks, infantry, the whole Iron Parade barrel across the 38th parallel. It's not a border anymore. It's a suggestion, and it evaporates the moment the People's Army thunders into Seoul. South Korea is caught flat-footed. American troops are rushed in under the banner of the United Nations. But let's be honest, it's mostly American uniforms, American guns, and American fears. The Cold War has turned hot. Mainstream historical fact. The Korean War wasn't officially a war. The US Congress never declared one. It was labeled a police action under the UN. But tell that to the soldiers frozen in the Chosan Reservoir or pinned in the mud near Incheon. Your journey drops you into a tent somewhere outside Busan. A fan squeaks overhead. A map lies sprawled across a table, all red arrows and worry lines. General Douglas MacArthur, Hollywood jawline, corncob pipe, Lin's over it. He wants to strike back. Hard, and strike he does. September 1950, the Incheon landing, a wild, high-risk amphibious assault behind enemy lines. Everyone says it won't work. Tides are bad. Shoreline is rocky. But MacArthur rolls the dice. And it works. North Korean lines buckle. South Korean forces surge back. For a brief moment, it looks like the tide of war is turning. You march north, past charred villages, past propaganda slogans scrawled on stone walls. By October, UN forces cross the 38th parallel. The goal shifts from defense to reunification. MacArthur pushes toward the Yalu River, the edge of China. And that's when things explode. Because China? Not having it. Quirky fact. Mao Zedong reportedly warned the US, through Indian intermediaries, multiple times, that if American troops approached the Yalu, China would enter the war. The warning was ignored. One American official called it Oriental bluff. Spoiler alert, it wasn't bluff. November 1950. Out of the hills, the Chinese army descends. Hundreds of thousands of them, wearing canvas sneakers in the snow, blowing bugles before attacks. It's not just eerie, it's devastating. The front collapses. UN troops retreat in what historians still call one of the longest withdrawals in US military history. You slog south through ice, mud, and fear. The Battle of the Chosin Reservoir turns into a brutal endurance test. Temperatures drop to 35 degrees. Guns jam. Medics can't pierce frozen skin with morphine needles. Some soldiers fight with socks over their hands. Historians still argue whether MacArthur's overreach was brilliant ambition or reckless arrogance. Some say the war could have ended at the 38th. Others think pushing north was the only way to win. Either way, Truman has had enough. April 1951. MacArthur is fired for insubordination, for wanting to nuke China, for writing open letters that sound more like manifestos than military updates. He returns to the US to a hero's welcome. But he's out. The war grinds on. You spend the next 2 years stuck in déjà vu. Frontline shift, then stall. Hill 355. Pork Chop Hill. Bloody Ridge. The names sound like diner menu items, but they're soaked in blood and fog. Soldiers fight over terrain that changes hands more often than poker chips. And the home front, it's tired. Korea is the war no one wants to think about. Too distant, too confusing. Not nearly as cinematic as World War II. Letters from the front speak of cold feet and missing friends. Meanwhile, Washington debates, negotiate or escalate. By 1953, both sides are exhausted. Stalin dies in March, a turning point. The Soviet Union softens just enough to let peace talks breathe. July 27, 1953. An armistice is signed. No peace treaty. No victory parade. Just a fragile ceasefire and a demilitarized zone, the DMZ, stretching like a scar across the 38th parallel. And that's where you find yourself now. In the middle of this strange no man's land, where birds chirp louder than soldiers talk. You can see both north and south from here. Flags flutter. Soldiers stare across barbed wire. It's peaceful, but tense, like two fighters in a clinch, waiting for the bell. Quirky side note. the DMZ becomes an accidental nature reserve. Because no humans are allowed in, rare species like red-crowned cranes and endangered bears thrive. Nature, it seems, ignores ideology. The Korean War sets the template for Cold War conflict. No full-scale world war, but plenty of blood. Proxy war, limited war, a taste of what's to come. Back in the US, people don't quite know what to make of it. 36,000 Americans dead, millions of Koreans displaced, and yet, Korea fades into the background. They call it the Forgotten War. But you won't forget, not the freezing nights, not the leaflets fluttering from Chinese planes, not the look in a young soldier's eyes as he eats canned beans beneath artillery fire. Cold War lines are now etched in earth, defended by flesh and bone. You pull back from the DMZ. The mist curls low across the hills. Somewhere, a loudspeaker blares propaganda into the night. Choppy music, strange promises, hope mixed with menace. The war may be over, but nothing is settled. Not here. Not yet. You wake up under fluorescent lights. The hum of a fallout shelter's generator purring like a worried cat. It's the 1950s, and you're deep underground. Because up top, the world is practicing the fine art of apocalypse prevention by getting really good at apocalypse preparation. The air smells like canned peaches and anxiety. Above ground, the Cold War is entering its most atomic phase. The US and USSR aren't just rivals anymore. They're now custodians of weapons that could end the human story before the next season of I Love, Lucy. And somehow, both sides think that building more bombs is the best way to make sure they never get used. This is what they call mutually assured destruction, or MAD for short. And yes, the acronym is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Let's rewind just a moment. After the US dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, the world realized the rules had changed. For a few brief years, America had a monopoly on nuclear terror. But in 1949, the Soviet Union exploded its own atomic bomb, RDS-1, catching the West completely off guard. Cue panic. The US responds, go bigger. In 1952, America tests the first hydrogen bomb, a weapon 500 times more powerful than the ones dropped on Japan. The detonation at Eniwetok Atoll is so powerful, it doesn't just vaporize an island. It creates a crater over a mile wide and leaves behind a new kind of fear. Quirky fact: that first hydrogen bomb test, codenamed Ivy Mike, left behind a new element, Einsteinium, a synthetic element discovered in the radioactive debris. So yes, they literally invented new atoms just to show off. By 1955, the Soviets respond with their own H-bomb. And just like that, both sides are playing nuclear poker with aces up both sleeves and grenades for chips. And here's the kicker. They're not just making these weapons. They're stockpiling them like it's a Costco clearance sale. By the end of the 1950s, both superpowers have thousands of warheads, more than enough to turn the Earth into a glowing snow globe. So what do people do? They build bunkers. They hold duck and cover drills. They manufacture civil defense propaganda that tells kids to hide under desks, as if plywood will save you from gamma rays. And in suburbia, people stock up on Geiger counters, powdered milk, and DIY fallout shelter plans from Popular Mechanics. Some Americans dig their own bomb shelters next to the Rose Garden. Others practice evacuation drills that assume traffic on the freeway will behave rationally during a nuclear panic. Spoiler, it doesn't. Meanwhile, politicians walk the tightrope of deterrence. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the five-star general turned president, embraces the doctrine of massive retaliation. The idea, if the Soviets step one toe out of line, the US will respond with overwhelming nuclear force. All or nothing. Ashes or victory. But Eisenhower is also worried. He knows what's at stake. In 1953, he delivers his now famous Atoms for Peace speech at the United Nations. The message? Let's find ways to use nuclear technology for good. Medicine, energy, science. Let's stop building bombs and start building reactors. It's idealistic, noble, and mostly ignored. Because while leaders talk peace, engineers build missiles. The 1950s usher in a new terrifying marvel: intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. These rockets can carry nukes across oceans in under 30 minutes. That's shorter than your average sitcom episode. And just when you think it can't get more surreal, the US begins developing plans like Operation Dropshot, a theoretical blueprint for how to fight and win a nuclear war. It includes hundreds of targets across the USSR and casualty estimates that read like biblical plagues. The Soviets have their own version, just as grim, just as insane. Historical debate. Did the buildup of nuclear weapons actually prevent World War III, or did it bring us terrifyingly close to it? Some historians argue that nuclear deterrence kept the peace through fear. Others say it was dumb luck, near misses, and a few sane hands on very dangerous buttons. And then there's the culture. You're watching 1950s television when an ad for radium-based toothpaste airs. Glowing white teeth, courtesy of mild radioactivity. On the playground, kids collect glow-in-the-dark rings from cereal boxes, coated in actual radioactive material. In Nevada, tourists sip martinis while watching nuclear test clouds bloom over the desert. Quirky truth. Between 1951 and 1962, Las Vegas casinos promoted atomic tourism. Guests were given blast viewing schedules, and women competed in pageants like Miss Atomic Bomb. The mushroom cloud became a fashion accessory, but under all the atomic enthusiasm, the anxiety runs deep. You find yourself sitting in a school gymnasium during a civil defense lecture. A man with horn-rimmed glasses and a pointer stick explains fallout patterns using colored chalk. The PTA nods gravely, while behind them, children doodle mushroom clouds in crayon. The nuclear threat becomes an invisible roommate, always present, sometimes loud, sometimes quiet, but always there. And the world keeps spinning, because in this upside-down era, both sides agree on one thing: nuclear war is unthinkable, which is why they keep preparing for it. The paradox of the age: To ensure survival, you must master annihilation, build more bombs, train more soldiers, dig deeper bunkers, all while pretending that this is normal, that civilization isn't one bad decision away from becoming a smoldering cautionary tale. As you leave the shelter and step into the daylight, you glance at the horizon. Blue skies, birdsong, children riding bikes. It's all still here, but beneath the surface, under the baseball fields and backyards, are silos, missiles, triggers, waiting. Not fired, not yet. You slip on a trench coat, adjust your fedora, and casually tuck a briefcase under your arm. The park bench you're walking toward? It's not for feeding pigeons today. It's for dead drops. Welcome to the murky world of Cold War espionage, where trust is a liability and everyone might be a double agent, a mole, or just some unlucky guy who picked the wrong day to sit on the wrong bench. It's the 1950s through the 1970s, and while missiles loom overhead, the real Cold War battles are unfolding in shadows, played out not with tanks, but with microfilm, poison, and extremely bad disguises. Think less James Bond, and more, well, burned-out bureaucrat with a knack for code breaking and a fondness for gray suits. This is the age of the CIA and the KGB, two organizations that turned the world into a stage for cloak and dagger drama. And if the nukes are Plan Z, the spies are every plan before it. Let's start with the basics. After World War II, the US creates the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, a covert group with a vague job description and an even vaguer set of rules. The Soviets have their own beast, the Komitet Gosударственной Безопасности, KGB, part spy agency, part secret police, part boogeyman. Both are obsessed with secrets, and both are everywhere. Espionage becomes a full-time job for hundreds of thousands of people. Real people with families, hobbies, and 9-to-5 routines. Plus, maybe a cyanide pill in the hollowed-out heel of their shoe. Quirky fact: the CIA once trained cats to be spies. No, really. Operation Acoustic Kitty was a classified project that involved surgically implanting microphones into cats and training them to eavesdrop. The first mission ended quickly when the cat got hit by a taxi. The operation was deemed a failure, but technically, the cat completed one objective. It went undetected. Now back to humans. The Soviets score big early on by infiltrating the Manhattan Project, the US top-secret nuclear bomb effort. People like Klaus Fuchs and Julius and Ethel Rosenberg leak critical information that helps the USSR develop its own nukes years ahead of schedule. The Rosenbergs, convicted of espionage, are executed in 1953. It's one of the Cold War's most controversial episodes. Some see them as traitors, others as scapegoats in a Red Scare frenzy. Over in the USSR, paranoia is baked into the system. The KGB listens, watches, bugs, blackmails, dissidents, intellectuals, even old Bolsheviks aren't safe. If you speak too freely in Moscow, you might wake up in Siberia. But espionage isn't just about stealing secrets. It's about manipulating entire governments. Case in point, Iran, 1953. The CIA and Britain's MI6 orchestrate a coup to remove Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh after he nationalizes Iranian oil. They replace him with a pro-Western Shah. The mission is slick, messy, and sets off a chain reaction that will come back to bite America 2 decades later. Then, in Guatemala 1954, the CIA helps overthrow President Jacobo Arbenz, fearing he's too friendly with communists. The result? A civil war that lasts 36 years. Welcome to the era of covert action, where countries don't declare war anymore. They just quietly tip over governments like dominoes and deny everything. Meanwhile, both the CIA and KGB become masters of absurdity, disguises, exploding cigars, invisible ink, code names like Zephyr, Top Hat, and Garbo, messages hidden in hollow coins, surveillance pigeons, bugged hotel rooms. It sounds like a spy parody, but it's all real. One of the most famous spy cases, the Cambridge Five, a group of British double agents who fed the Soviets top-tier intel for years. They were well-educated, well-connected, and completely disillusioned with capitalism. One of them, Kim Philby, eventually defected to Moscow, where he lived the rest of his life under close KGB watch and mild vodka haze. Historical debate. Was the CIA's strategy of toppling foreign leaders effective or reckless? Supporters say it stopped the spread of communism. Critics argue it destabilized entire regions and bred decades of resentment, leading to blowback like the Iranian Revolution and long-term mistrust of US foreign policy. Back home, America is obsessed with the spy threat. Movies, books, and pulp fiction thrive. Ian Fleming publishes Casino Royale in 1953, introducing James Bond, a suave British spy who somehow never wrinkles his tuxedo while defusing bombs or wooing double agents. Bond becomes the fantasy, the Cold War made sexy. In reality, most spies look more like accountants than action heroes. They spend their days deciphering encrypted cables, trying not to get tailed, and occasionally choking on a cyanide capsule if things go sideways. And then there's Berlin, the divided city that becomes the unofficial capital of espionage. CIA and KGB agents run operations just blocks apart. Tunnels are dug beneath streets. Bugs are planted in embassy walls. And handoffs happen in dimly lit alleys. Quirky detail. In 1961, the CIA built a tunnel under East Berlin to tap Soviet telephone lines. It was a massive operation called Operation Gold. The twist? The KGB already knew about it, thanks to a British mole named George Blake, and fed this information through the line for months. The espionage game escalates with technology. Satellites begin photographing missile sites from space. The US launches the U-2 spy plane, which can fly above Soviet radar, until 1960, when one is shot down, and its pilot, Gary Powers, is captured. The incident derails a peace summit and proves just how risky this invisible war can be. By the 1970s, both sides have developed elaborate spy networks, but also something else: fatigue. It's hard to stay paranoid forever. Some agents burn out, some switch sides, some go rogue, and some just write memoirs. Still, the games continue. You might think of the Cold War as a standoff between two nuclear giants. But beneath that, it's really a million little stabs in the dark, whispers in cafes, files slipped into briefcases, identities swapped in the dead of night. And maybe, just maybe, the reason those missiles never launched is because someone, somewhere, bugged the right room, read the right letter, or poisoned the right cigar. In this era, information isn't just power, it's survival. The monsoon is pouring. Your boots sink into Korean mud, with every step soaked straight through from hours of marching. The air smells like gunpowder, wet rice fields, and fear, because no one really knows who's winning anymore, or even why this battle is still dragging on. Welcome to Korea, 1950-1953, the so-called Forgotten War. That's anything but forgettable when you're stuck in the thick of it. This is the Cold War's first hot conflict. The gloves are off, bullets are flying, and for the first time since 1945, American and Soviet-backed forces go head-to-head. Not directly, of course. No, that would be too obvious. Instead, they use proxies, pawns, and a divided peninsula as the chessboard. Let's back up a bit. After World War II, Japan's 35-year occupation of Korea ends. The peninsula is liberated, but instead of a smooth handover, the victors split it like a hastily shared pizza. The Soviets take the north, the Americans take the south. There's no vote, no plebiscite, just a line drawn across the 38th parallel, like a paper cut that never quite heals. North Korea, under Soviet-trained Kim Il-sung, becomes a communist state. South Korea, led by US-backed Syngman Rhee, is more capitalist, though not exactly a democratic utopia. Both sides claim they are the rightful government of all Korea, and neither side is particularly chill about it. Then comes June 25th, 1950. North Korea invades. Thousands of troops storm across the 38th parallel in a lightning assault. Within days, Seoul falls. It's a surprise attack, but not entirely unexpected. Kim Il-sung had been begging Stalin for months to let him go ahead with it. Stalin finally gives a cautious nod. Mao Zedong in China is wary, but interested. And just like that, the Cold War turns hot. The United States scrambles. President Harry Truman doesn't go through Congress. He calls it a police action under the United Nations flag. The UN votes to send troops, with the Soviets absent due to a protest walkout. Oops. America leads the charge, with 16 other nations providing troops, including the UK, Canada, Turkey, and even Ethiopia. Cue General Douglas MacArthur. Yes, that MacArthur, the pipe-smoking Waptoo's icon with a god complex. He's given command and stages one of the boldest moves of the war. The Incheon landing in September 1950. He lands troops behind enemy lines, retakes Seoul, and pushes the North Koreans all the way back to the Yalu River, right on China's border. It looks like victory, except China isn't having it. Mao Zedong, fearing US troops on his doorstep, unleashes a massive counterattack. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers, volunteers, technically, swarm into Korea in a terrifying human wave. The US is caught off guard. MacArthur wants to bomb China, maybe even nuke them. But Truman says no. So, MacArthur does what you never do in the military. He publicly criticizes his commander-in-chief. Truman fires him in April 1951. Cue the drama. Americans are furious. MacArthur is a hero to many. Truman is accused of appeasement, but cooler heads barely prevail. No nukes are dropped. Mainstream fact: the Korean War killed over 3 million people, including more than 36,000 American troops. Civilians bore the brunt with widespread massacres, bombings, and forced relocations. It was one of the bloodiest conflicts of the 20th century, yet rarely gets mentioned in textbooks. The fighting continues into a brutal stalemate. Inch by inch, hill by hill, soldiers die for ground that's taken, lost, and retaken again. It's trench warfare all over again, but with more frostbite and less poetry. The winters are vicious. Supplies freeze. So do men. American pilots dropped 635,000 tons of bombs, more than in the entire Pacific theater of WWII. They also dropped 32,000 tons of napalm, torching entire villages in what the US calls strategic bombing, and what others might call deeply questionable, quirky detail. At one point, the North Korean army uses trombone players to sound battle charges. Apparently, nothing strikes fear into enemy lines like the aggressive toot of a brass instrument. By 1953, everyone's exhausted. Stalin dies in March. The new Soviet leadership is less interested in grinding wars. China's resources are drained. The US public is souring. A ceasefire is finally signed on July 27, 1953. But, plot twist, there's no peace treaty, just an armistice. Technically, North and South Korea are still at war. The demilitarized zone, DMZ, you hear about on the news? It's the legacy of that armistice. A 160-mile strip of no man's land, guarded day and night, sometimes by robots, and always by nerves. So why is this called the Forgotten War? Maybe because it doesn't have a clean ending, or because it wasn't a clear victory, or because it sits awkwardly between the glory of WWII and the trauma of Vietnam. But to the millions who fought, fled, or died, it's unforgettable. Historians still argue whether the Korean War was a necessary stand against communist aggression or an overreach driven by containment paranoia. Either way, it becomes the blueprint for future Cold War conflicts. A proxy fight, ambiguous outcomes, and a whole lot of unintended consequences. Today, North Korea remains one of the world's most closed and militarized societies, a direct descendant of this conflict. And the South? A high-tech democratic powerhouse that emerged from rubble and repression. Two siblings, forever separated by politics, propaganda, and barbed wire. So, you slosh through the mud, listening to artillery in the distance, and wondering if peace will ever really come to this place. And even if it does, will anyone remember the Cold War's first battlefield didn't end in apocalypse, but it did set the rules. No direct superpower confrontation, just devastating wars waged far from home. In other words, this was just the beginning. You're lying in the grass on a warm October night in 1957, staring up at the stars, when, wait, what is that? It's not a shooting star. It's not a plane. It's beeping. That's Sputnik 1 the Soviet Union's shiny metal basketball of a satellite, zipping across the sky and broadcasting a ghostly radio pulse. It's the first man-made object to orbit Earth. It doesn't do much, just beeps. But those beeps send chills down every spine from Washington to Walla Walla. Because now, the Cold War has blasted off into outer space. Welcome to the space race, where Cold War rivalry goes full sci-fi. It's a race not just for orbit, but for hearts, minds, and ideological dominance. Fought with rockets, cosmonauts, chimpanzees, and moon boots. Let's break it down. Quirky. Detail. Soviet engineers painted Sputnik with a mirror finish so it would be easy to spot. Amateur astronomers across the globe watched in awe as the little sphere raced overhead at 18,000 miles per hour. The beeping signal? It became an accidental pop culture icon, broadcast on ham radios and news programs, sounding like some cosmic heartbeat. The United States freaks out. This isn't just a tech flex, it's a threat. If the Soviets can launch a satellite, maybe they can launch a nuclear warhead. Maybe they're watching from above. Maybe they're better at science. It's the missile gap panic. Only now, it's literally orbiting overhead. America scrambles to respond. In 1958, they launch Explorer-1, their own satellite, and along with it, they create NASA, a sleek new space agency designed to catch up and overtake the Soviets. Suddenly, every American kid wants a telescope, a toy rocket, and an A+ in math. Meanwhile, the USSR doubles down. Next up, Laika, the most famous stray dog in history. In November 1957, she becomes the first living creature to orbit Earth aboard Sputnik 2. It's both a scientific triumph and a tragedy. Laika didn't survive, sparking global debates about animal ethics and Soviet secrecy. But the Americans aren't exactly gentle either. Enter the monkeys. In 1959, two rhesus macaques, Abel and Baker, ride a Jupiter rocket 300 miles above Earth and come back alive, becoming Cold War celebrities. Newspapers gush over them. They do press tours. At one point, Baker receives more fan mail than most human astronauts. Seriously, these animals are the unsung heroes of early space exploration, paving the way, often unwillingly, for humans to follow. Then comes the big milestone: human space flight. On April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin, a 27-year-old Soviet pilot with a megawatt smile, climbs into Vostok 1 and becomes the first human in space. He orbits Earth once, shouts, "Poyakali, let's go," and returns safely. He becomes a national hero and a global symbol of Soviet prowess. America is stunned again. But just a few weeks later, a young President, John F. Kennedy, gives a now legendary speech. It's bold, maybe a little reckless. He declares that the United States will put a man on the moon before this decade is out. Most people blink. The US hadn't even gotten a person into orbit yet. But that's the Cold War. Audacity is everything. Mainstream fact. The US didn't just want to beat the USSR to the moon. It wanted to broadcast it. Every Apollo mission had a PR team. The moon landing in 1969 was watched by over 600 million people, becoming the most viewed event in human history at the time. This wasn't just science. It was soft power on a planetary scale. As the 60s unfold, The two superpowers lob astronauts and cosmonauts into the void at a dizzying pace. There's Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space. There's Gemini, Vostok, Soyuz, and the mighty Apollo program. Each launch is a gamble. High risk, high reward. The technology is new. The stakes are higher than ever. And behind it all is the lingering fear that space might become the next battlefield. And it almost does. There's serious talk in both the US and USSR about weaponizing space. Missiles in orbit, space stations with nukes, death race, Star Wars, before George Lucas even gets to it. But in a rare moment of sanity, cooler heads prevail. In 1967, the Outer Space Treaty is signed. No nukes, no bases, no military operations in space. At least in theory. Historians still debate who won the space race. The Soviets scored early victories. First satellite, first animal, first man, first woman. But the Americans hit the jackpot with Apollo 11. When Neil Armstrong steps onto the moon on July 20th, 1969, it's a mic drop moment for the West. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, he says. And somewhere, Khrushchev probably groans. But here's the thing. Nobody stayed on the moon. The race cooled down. The bragging rights faded. Eventually, both sides started thinking less about winning and more about collaborating. By the late 1970s, astronauts and cosmonauts are shaking hands in orbit, and space becomes less of a battlefield and more of a science lab. Sort of. Today, the legacy of the space race lives on in GPS, satellite internet, SpaceX, and your weather app. But its roots are here, in this weird moment of history, when two superpowers hurled monkeys, dogs, and eventually humans into space, not just to explore, but to prove a point. So next time you look up at the moon, remember, it's not just a big glowing rock. It's Cold War territory, a place where fear and ambition, science and politics, propaganda and curiosity all collided at escape velocity. And it all started with a metal beach ball and a dog named Laika. It's October 1962. You're lying awake again. But this time, it's not the soft hum of a fan that keeps you up. It's the sirens, the hollow clatter of emergency broadcasts, the palpable, terrifying sense that this might be it. This might be the night the world ends. You live in the nuclear shadow now, a world where push-button apocalypse is a real possibility, where basements become bomb shelters, and school children practice duck and cover drills that everyone quietly knows won't help. And now, it's all come to a head in a place you probably can't even point to on a map. Cuba. Let's rewind. Cuba had been America's tropical playground for decades. Sugar, cigars, and casinos run by mobsters in wide lapel suits. But in 1959, a bearded guerrilla named Fidel Castro overthrew the US-backed dictator Batista and declared Cuba a Marxist-Leninist state. Yikes. America tried to charm him. That failed. Then tried to kill him. Also failed, repeatedly, often in ways that felt more like a cartoon than covert ops. Exploding cigars, poisoned wetsuits, a chemically treated beard oil designed to make his iconic beard fall out and embarrass him? Yes, all real. quirky detail locked and loaded, but none of it worked. In 1961, the CIA trained a ragtag group of Cuban exiles for an amphibious invasion at the Bay of Pigs. It was a disaster, a total embarrassment for the new, photogenic US President, John F. Kennedy. Castro's position? Stronger than ever. Feeling the heat, Cuba turned to the Soviet Union and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. He, of the shoe-banging at the UN fame, saw an opportunity. Cuba was 90 miles from Florida. Khrushchev wanted to even the playing field. If America could station missiles in Turkey and Italy, aimed at Moscow, why couldn't the Soviets do the same in Havana? So, in the summer of 1962, Soviet ships began sneaking nuclear missiles into Cuba under the cover of civilian cargo. By mid-October, American spy planes took pictures of missile installations under construction. And that's when it hits. The world is on a countdown to nuclear war. Kennedy is briefed. Advisors are split. The military wants to bomb the sites and invade. Others warned that could trigger a Soviet retaliation, not in Cuba, but in Berlin or maybe even Chicago. Kennedy opts for a third way, a naval blockade, or as they gently rebrand it, a quarantine, to avoid calling it an act of war. He goes on national television, calm, serious, the weight of the planet on his shoulders, and announces to the world what's happening. The world holds its breath. For 13 days, October 16 to 28, 1962, the world teeters on the edge. You read headlines like US ships confront Soviet freighters and missile bases still under construction. You wonder if this is the last newspaper you'll ever read. Schools cancel classes. Bomb shelters are stocked. Washington and Moscow trade letters. Some official, some deeply personal. Here's where it gets hair-raising. A Soviet submarine, B-59, near Cuba, is surrounded by American warships. They drop depth charges to force it to surface, not knowing it's armed with a nuclear torpedo. Inside the sub, conditions are unbearable. 120 degrees, no fresh air, panic mounting. The captain thinks war has already started and wants to launch. But there's one man, Vasily Arkhipov, who refuses. He persuades the others to stand down. Historians still argue whether Arkhipov's decision single-handedly prevented World War III. Back above water, things get more surreal. Khrushchev offers a public deal. If the US promises not to invade Cuba, the missiles will be removed. Then he sends a second, secret letter. Remove your missiles from Turkey, and we'll call it even. Kennedy publicly accepts the first offer, quietly agrees to the second. Everyone saves face. The Soviet missiles leave. The US missiles in Turkey are removed months later, quietly. Castro is furious. He wasn't even consulted, but the planet exhales. Mainstream fact. The Cuban Missile Crisis is considered the closest the world has ever come to full-scale nuclear war. No single event of the Cold War drew us closer to the brink, and none changed policy as dramatically. Afterwards, things change. A direct phone line, the hotline, is installed between Washington and Moscow, so leaders can speak instantly instead of relaying messages through embassies and misinterpretations. You know, to avoid accidentally ending civilization. The US and USSR also signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963, banning nuclear tests in the atmosphere, underwater, or in space. Still, the fear doesn't go away. Nuclear stockpiles continue to grow. More warheads, faster delivery systems, bigger booms. But after Cuba, everyone starts to realize maybe there really is such a thing as too much brinkmanship. This was the high watermark of Cold War danger, a moment when school desks and concrete bunkers stood between you and oblivion. And the thing is, the whole time, the world kept spinning. Kids went to school. Couples went on dates. Someone somewhere got married with a fallout shelter as their wedding venue, because even when humanity stands on the cliff's edge, we somehow still remember to pack sandwiches. So now, when you hear the words Cuban Missile Crisis, don't just think of JFK's square jaw or those grainy spy photos. Think of those 13 days when everyone, from Soviet subcommanders to Midwestern school teachers, thought, for real, this might be the end. And the miracle is, it wasn't. You're sweating again. Jungle sweat. The kind that doesn't dry. It just clings to your skin like regret. The air's thick with diesel fumes, bug repellent, and the ever-present stench of something smoldering. There's a low hum from a chopper somewhere in the distance. A rhythmic thump, thump, thump that never quite fades. And every so often, just often enough to keep your heart doing that weird stutter step, you hear the pop, pop, pop of gunfire. Yeah, you're not in Kansas anymore. You're in Vietnam. And despite what the generals told everyone back home, this isn't going to be quick, or easy, or remotely understandable. Let's back up. After World War II, Vietnam was supposed to go back to being a sleepy colony under French rule. But Vietnam had other plans. A wiry, chain-smoking revolutionary named Ho Chi Minh had been fighting for independence for decades. He admired George Washington, quoted the U.S. Declaration of Independence, and initially hoped America might back his dream of a free Vietnam. But then, Cold War logic showed up like an uninvited party guest, yelling about communism and dominoes, and how if one Asian country went red, the whole continent might tip over like a folding table. So, in 1954, the French got whooped at Dien Bien Phu and left in a huff. Vietnam got split in two, a communist north led by Uncle Ho and a shaky south propped up by the US, with a Catholic president named Ngo Dinh Diem, who wasn't exactly Mr. Popular. The plan was to hold elections to reunite the country. Spoiler, those elections never happened. Surprise twist, war. Now, remember those dominoes America was so worried about. The Eisenhower and then Kennedy administrations became convinced that if South Vietnam fell to communism, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and maybe even Australia would follow. You know, because apparently Geography works like a row of Jenga blocks. So America started small. Just advisors, military trainers, gear, moral support. But soon, advisors were shooting back. And then, after a murky event in 1964 called the Gulf of Tonkin Incident, which historians still argue whether it was a real attack or a radar ghost amplified by paranoia, Congress gave President Johnson a blank check. They called it the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. It might as well have been titled, "Go ahead and wage war. We won't ask questions." By 1965, US combat troops were landing on Vietnamese beaches like it was Normandy. Except, it wasn't Normandy. There were no front lines, no clear enemies in uniform, no easy victory conditions. Just rice paddies, booby traps, and ambushes that turned every tree and tunnel into a potential death trap. You ride in helicopters with soldiers who blast rock music to keep their nerves steady. Jimi Hendrix, Creedence Clearwater Revival, The Doors. You slide down into fire bases carved out of muddy hillsides where soldiers write home about nothing because there's nothing new to say. The war doesn't move forward. It just churns. And at the heart of this mess is something grimly poetic. A war fought by a superpower with jets, napalm, and chemical defoliants against an enemy in sandals, carrying homemade grenades in bamboo baskets. The Viet Cong, South Vietnamese communist rebels, don't play by American rules. They vanish into the jungle, the tunnels, the shadows. They plant traps made from sharpened bamboo and discarded cans. You never see them, but they're always there. So, the US escalates, drops Agent Orange to kill off jungle cover. Never mind that it'll cause cancers and birth defects for generations. Rains down napalm, that sticky, burning death in a can that clings to skin and turns villages into firestorms. You probably remember that iconic photo, the little girl running, screaming, naked, her back on fire. Her name's Phan Thi Kim Phuc, and she survived. But that image would come to define a war already careening off the rails. You try to measure progress with body counts. Seriously, that's what the brass is doing. Stacking statistics, not victories. And the press? Well, they're in country too. And they're not exactly towing the government line. For the first time in history, Americans watch a war unfold in real time on their TVs. They see soldiers burning huts, villagers fleeing, and coffins coming home draped in flags. It's not exactly the rah-rah patriotism of World War II. It's disillusionment on full display. And back home, things are boiling over. Draft cards are burning. Students are protesting. Hippies are handing out flowers and chanting peace slogans, while police lob tear gas into crowds. The line between patriot and protester gets blurrier by the day. Some of the draft dodgers flee to Canada. Others go to prison. A few burn themselves alive in public squares in acts of desperate protest. Meanwhile, working-class kids, especially black and brown soldiers, get shipped off in disproportionate numbers. Muhammad Ali refuses the draft with the now legendary line, "I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong." And the government? It doubles down. By 1968, the US has over 500,000 troops in Vietnam. That's the year the Tet Offensive happens, a coordinated surprise attack by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong across dozens of cities during the Lunar New Year holiday. US and South Vietnamese forces eventually push them back. But the psychological damage is done. Americans at home watch their embassy in Saigon being attacked and think, wait, are we losing? Even the government starts to crack. President Lyndon Johnson announces he won't seek re-election. Soldiers in the field stop trusting their commanders. Fragging becomes a dark undercurrent. Cases where soldiers lob grenades into officers' tents out of frustration, fear, or protest. Yeah, this war isn't just bloody, it's broken. And then comes My Lai, a small hamlet in Quang Ngai province. American soldiers, believing it to be a Viet Cong stronghold, sweep through it in 1968. What they find is mostly women, children, and old men. And what they do is unspeakable. Over 500 civilians are slaughtered. It doesn't hit the press until a year later. But when it does, it shatters any illusion of moral high ground. The photographer, Ronald Haberly, took pictures that would sear into the public consciousness forever. The army tried to keep it quiet. Only one officer, Lieutenant William Calley, was convicted. His sentence? Life. He served 3 years under house arrest. That's it. Now, before you spiral too far into the moral abyss, let's pull back for a moment. Despite the chaos, not all was lost. Stories emerge of soldiers protecting villagers, medics dragging the wounded to safety under fire, and Vietnamese civilians sheltering or saving American troops. But those moments, those glimmers, are overshadowed by a sense of futility that blankets everything like monsoon fog. Back in Washington, the political tides begin to shift. Richard Nixon campaigns on a promise of peace with honor, whatever that means. He starts drawing troops down in a process called Vietnamization, pushing South Vietnam to take more of the burden. But even as American boots start leaving, the bombing escalates, especially in Cambodia and Laos, which weren't even officially at war. It's like trying to end a fire by dropping more matches. And through it all, a fundamental question hangs over everything like a jungle mist. Why? What are we doing here? What does victory even mean? Can you win a civil war halfway around the world in a country that never asked you to intervene in the first place? Historians still argue whether the Vietnam War was a noble mistake, a necessary stand against communism, or a doomed blunder fueled by hubris and misunderstanding. But one thing's certain: by the time it's over, nobody's cheering. The body count is staggering. Over 58,000 Americans dead, and millions of Vietnamese, Laotians, and Cambodians. You board a chopper for the last time. Boots muddy, uniforms soaked with sweat. Somewhere behind you, smoke curls up from another burned-out village. Ahead lies Saigon, still standing. But the war isn't over yet. Not really. Not for the Vietnamese. Not for the soldiers carrying invisible wounds home. Not for a nation that still can't quite talk about what happened without getting stuck in its throat. You step off the bus into a haze of incense and anti-war chants. Tie-dye banners flutter like psychedelic prayers in the breeze. A guy in bell-bottoms hands you a daisy. Someone's quoting Bob Dylan. Someone else is yelling about the military-industrial complex. Over at the edge of the park, a lone saxophone plays all along the watchtower, and the whole thing feels like a dream. If that dream were sponsored by draft dodgers, acid, and a deep distrust of the American government. Welcome to the other Vietnam front, home. It's the late 1960s. And if you've just arrived from the steaming jungles of Southeast Asia, this place feels like another planet. Out there, it was mud, bullets, and burning tree lines. Back here, it's beads, protest signs, and open mic poetry about Nixon being a robot. You're not sure which one's more surreal. Let's zoom out. The Vietnam War wasn't just fought in rice paddies. It was fought in the hearts, minds, and streets of America. And as the body bags piled up, a new battlefield emerged. College campuses, concert fields, living rooms, and late-night TV. It was a war of information, image, ideology, and no one came out clean. So let's talk about the hippies first. You've seen them in the pictures. Flowing hair, flower crowns, make love not war signs. But they weren't just wandering around strumming guitars. Many were deeply political, students, organizers, draft resistors, veterans turned pacifists. The counterculture wasn't some hazy sideshow. It was a genuine rebellion against authority, conformity, and what they called the establishment. In 1967, they threw a full-blown anti-war bee in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park. That same year, over 100,000 people marched on the Pentagon. Not stormed, marched. They carried signs, chanted slogans, and some tried to levitate the building through group meditation. No joke. The idea wasn't to attack. It was to overwhelm with absurdity, to disarm with peace. The government, it didn't quite know what to do. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover labeled many protest leaders as dangerous subversives and activated COINTELPRO, a secret program that spied on, infiltrated, and sabotaged civil rights and anti-war groups. Think fake letters, wiretaps, and agents provocateurs, pretending to be more radical than the radicals, just to sow division. But protests kept growing. By 1969, over 500,000 people gathered on the National Mall for the moratorium to end the war in Vietnam. Entire towns started hosting teach-ins and draft counseling centers. Even soldiers in uniform began marching. Veterans tossed their medals over the White House fence in disgust. The tide was turning, but the government was still insisting everything was going great. That victory was just around the corner. That the North Vietnamese were nearly defeated. That Americans should stay the course. Then came the leak. You're sitting in your kitchen in 1971, spooning cold cereal, when the evening news drops a bombshell bigger than napalm. The New York Times has published the Pentagon Papers, a classified, top-secret history of the Vietnam War, 7,000 pages of it. And it turns out, it was all a lie, not just the usual political spin. The documents, compiled by military analyst Daniel Ellsberg, show that multiple U.S. administrations, from Truman to Nixon, had systematically misled the public. The government knew early on that the war was unwinnable. They knew that escalation wouldn't bring victory. And yet, they kept sending young men to die, kept telling the American people to hold fast. The Pentagon Papers didn't reveal a single smoking gun. They revealed an entire smoking arsenal. Nixon, who'd already been paranoid and secretive, completely lost it. He tried to block the papers' release. The case went to the Supreme Court, which ruled in favor of the press, citing the First Amendment. Nixon's administration then created a covert group, the so-called plumbers, to plug further leaks. You'll hear more about them soon. Spoiler: it doesn't go well. In Ellsberg, they tried to discredit him too. The plumbers even broke into his psychiatrist's office, hoping to dig up dirt. But Ellsberg stood firm. He said simply, "I felt that as an American citizen, as a responsible citizen, I could no longer cooperate in concealing this information from the American public." Mic drop. The leak shook the country to its core. If the government had lied about Vietnam, what else had they lied about? Could you trust them at all? Suddenly, everything was fair game. The war, the draft, the CIA, the FBI, even the presidency itself. A once reverent public now turned skeptical, even cynical. Political cartoons went from flags and eagles to Nixon hiding behind sandbags made of lies. Trust in government plummeted, something that would never quite recover. Meanwhile, the protests didn't slow down, and they weren't always peaceful. Take Kent State, 1970. A group of students protesting Nixon's decision to bomb Cambodia gets confronted by National Guard troops. Tensions rise, and then gunshots. 4 students killed, 9 wounded. Some weren't even protesting, just walking to class. The shock ripples across the country. A photo of a young woman kneeling over a fallen body becomes another icon of the age. The backlash is fierce. Some Americans blame the students. Others demand justice. But one thing's clear: the war is now tearing America apart, not just abroad, but in its very soul. And don't forget Jackson State either. Just 10 days after Kent State, police opened fire on students at a historically black college in Mississippi. 2 dead, barely a blip in the national media, because even in protest, race still mattered. Black Americans, who'd been disproportionately drafted and killed in Vietnam, now watched as their communities were surveilled, infiltrated, and suppressed. The civil rights movement and the anti-war movement weren't separate. They overlapped, intersected, bled into one another. MLK himself had spoken out against the war before his assassination, calling America the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. It was all connected: the war, the lies, the racism, the resistance, and through it all, the music played. You hear Buffalo Springfield croon, "There's something happening here." You watch Country Joe and the Fish ask sarcastically, "What are we fighting for?" You feel the pulse of Woodstock, Monterey, and every campus folk duo strumming their guitars with blistered fingers and tear-streaked cheeks. This wasn't just protest. It was culture war. A war of clothes, haircuts, slang, and soundtracks. The clean-cut government types called it sedition. The protesters called it freedom. Either way, America was changing fast. And now, you're standing in a crowd again. Maybe in Chicago, maybe on the steps of a courthouse, maybe just outside your old high school. You're holding a sign, or a candle, or maybe a draft card going up in smoke. You don't know if you're making a difference. You just know you can't stay silent anymore. Because somewhere in Southeast Asia, a kid just like you is dying in a war he was told to believe in. And back here, the battle for truth, accountability, and peace has never felt more urgent. One war, two fronts, and no easy exits. The year is 1971, and you're holding a ping pong paddle in one hand and a steaming bowl of noodles in the other. The smell of soy sauce, nervous anticipation, and global diplomacy fills the air. You're not at an Olympic stadium or a UN meeting. You're in Beijing, baby, communist China, and believe it or not, you're part of history. Let's set the scene. For over 2 decades, the US and the People's Republic of China had been staring at each other from opposite ends of the geopolitical sandbox, refusing to play. Ever since Mao Zedong's Communist Revolution in 1949, the US had treated mainland China like the ex you pretend doesn't exist. America threw its diplomatic weight behind Taiwan instead, insisting that was the real China. Meanwhile, Mao dug in behind his bamboo curtain and told the West to buzz off. But under the surface, the world was shifting. Let's back up to Nixon, the guy who just a few years earlier had built his career hating communism. He called it the menace of our time. He accused people of being soft on it. He ranted, he raged, he hunted communists like it was a sport. But by the early 1970s, Nixon, now president, saw the writing on the wall. The Cold War was too cold, too rigid, and way too risky. He needed to shake the board, so what does he do? He decides to flip the script and make friends with the biggest, reddest player on the global stage, China. But he can't just show up with a fruit basket and knock on Mao's door. This is Cold War diplomacy, not PTA potluck. So Nixon and his brainy, brooding national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, start working behind the scenes. Enter ping pong. In 1971, during the World Table Tennis Championships in Japan, an American player named Glenn Cowan accidentally boards a bus full of Chinese athletes. Instead of shoving him off, Chinese player Zhuang Zedong offers him a silk-screen portrait of Mao. Cameras flash, smiles happen, and suddenly, the Cold War gets its first thaw. Not through bullets or treaties, but through table tennis. The headlines go wild. Ping-pong diplomacy. Within weeks, the US table tennis team is invited to China. They become the first American delegation to visit since 1949. They tour the Great Wall. They eat dumplings. They pose with pandas. Meanwhile, Nixon and Kissinger watch carefully. This was the opening they'd been waiting for. That summer, Kissinger secretly flies to Beijing on a plane with the windows blacked out. He meets with Premier Zhou Enlai to lay the groundwork. They talk Vietnam, Taiwan, and the Soviets. They talk war and peace. And most importantly, they agree. It's time to bring Nixon to China. Pause here to understand how wild this is. Imagine your grandpa suddenly deciding to hang out with his sworn enemy after 30 years of shouting matches. Nixon's visit to China in February 1972 was like Elvis walking into a Beatles concert and asking for an autograph. It was surreal, strategic, and symbolic all at once. When Nixon landed, millions watched on TV. He shook hands with Zhou Enlai, the same guy he'd once accused of masterminding global chaos. He walked the red carpet. He towed his wife, Pat Nixon, along in her bright red coat, so the Chinese could find her auspicious. The cameras rolled as Nixon visited the Forbidden City, toasted to the Chinese people, and sat down with Mao Zedong himself. The chairman, old and frail, but sharp as ever, told Nixon he was glad he came, even if they'd always disagree. It wasn't a love fest. It wasn't even warm, but it was reality, and that made it revolutionary. This wasn't just about symbolism. It was a massive geopolitical power move. You see, China had split from the Soviet Union back in the 1960s. Moscow and Beijing were no longer BFFs. There were border clashes, ideological disputes, and icy silence. Nixon knew that playing China against the USSR could break the deadlock of the Cold War. He wasn't making friends. He was playing chess, three-dimensional, slow burn, high-stakes diplomacy. And suddenly, the US had two communist giants looking at each other nervously, unsure who had the upper hand. Oh, and just to sweeten the pot, China gave America a pair of giant pandas, Ling Ling and Xing Xing. They were flown to the National Zoo in Washington, greeted like rock stars. American kids fell in love. Chinese kids waved little American flags. And somewhere, a tired Cold Warrior popped open a beer and thought, well, I'll be darned. That's why they call it panda diplomacy. It worked. After Nixon left Beijing, the world changed. Trade routes started to crack open. Diplomatic back channels stayed buzzing. Eventually, China got its seat at the United Nations, replacing Taiwan. The US still claimed it respected Taiwan's independence. But the writing was on the wall. China was rising, and Nixon, his approval ratings soared. For a moment, the world saw a version of the Cold War that didn't involve mushroom clouds or proxy wars. Just cameras, toasts, silk handshakes, and tiny plastic paddles. Of course, it wouldn't last. The Vietnam War was still bleeding. Watergate was waiting in the shadows. But for one glittering week, in February 1972, the Cold War took a breath. Just a breath. And all it took was a handshake, a ping-pong paddle, and two pandas with diplomatic passports. You stand now at the edge of the Great Wall, just like Nixon did, looking out over the snow-covered stones that wind into the fog. The past is ancient. The moment is fragile. The future is unwritten. And the message is clear. Sometimes, to break the ice, you need a little top spin. You're floating somewhere between a lava lamp and a mushroom cloud. It's the mid-1970s now, and the Cold War, that decades-long game of nuclear chicken, has taken a strange turn. After years of missile crises, coups, proxy wars, and enough chest-pounding rhetoric to fill a dozen action movies, the two superpowers have decided to get this chill out, sort of, temporarily, with caveats and matching pens. This is the age of détente, a French word meaning relaxation of tension. But don't let the soft vowels fool you. This is nuclear peace on a very short leash. You're walking now through a conference hall in Helsinki, Finland. There's the faint clink of crystal glasses, the shuffling of documents, and the smooth rustle of Cold War fashion. Stiff suits, serious mustaches, glasses thicker than Soviet winter coats. The smell is a mix of cigarette smoke, cologne, and vague suspicion. On one side of the long oval table, the United States, led by President Richard Nixon and later Gerald Ford, trying to keep the Western world glued together with duct tape and disco music. On the other side, the Soviet Union under Leonid Brezhnev, whose eyebrows alone could sign treaties. And right in the middle, the weirdest ceasefire of the 20th century. Let's rewind a second. After Nixon's big trip to China and the near-death experience that was the Cuban Missile Crisis, both Washington and Moscow started to realize something fundamental. No one wins a nuclear war, not even the guys with bigger missiles. And with Vietnam draining America's soul, and Soviet tanks burning gas in every direction, détente started to look appealing. The first major milestone? SALT I, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, signed in 1972. It's like two neighbors deciding not to build any more doomsday bunkers, while quietly remodeling the ones they already have. The SALT I agreement capped the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, and submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs, each side could maintain. It also included the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, ABM Treaty, which basically said, hey, let's not build crazy defense shields that would tempt us to fire first because we feel safe. Mainstream historical fact. SALT. I didn't reduce the nuclear threat. It just froze it. Imagine hitting pause on a bomb countdown, but keeping your finger hovering over play. Still, it was progress. And for a hot second, the world exhaled. You walk through suburban America now. There's color TV in the living room. Kids are learning to duck and cover under their desks. Disco is blooming like radioactive glitter. The Soviets are exporting vodka and grumpiness. The Americans are exporting Levi's and Bee Gees records. Cultural détente is in full swing too. Western films, filtered through censors, start trickling into the USSR. Soviet ballet tours the West. American jazz musicians, once barred from communist ears, now play smoky gigs in Moscow clubs. A Soviet and an American even shake hands in space during the Apollo-Soyuz mission in 1975. The first international crewed space flight. They share toothpaste, exchange flags, and float together 200 miles above Earth, while their countries maintain mutual distrust below. Sounds cozy, right? But here's the quirky twist. Détente was never about friendship. It was about self-preservation. Two old enemies learning to smile for the cameras while hiding knives behind their backs. And speaking of cameras, you can't ignore the TV spectacle of Leonid Brezhnev kissing everyone. This was a real thing. Brezhnev's notorious greeting style involved grabbing both cheeks and planting a firm, sometimes passionate kiss right on the lips. Western leaders were warned ahead of time. Pucker up or look rude. President Jimmy Carter dodged the smooch. Nixon took it like a champ. Historians still argue whether détente was a genuine step toward peace or just a convenient PR stunt during a particularly messy phase of the Cold War. Some say it delayed disaster. Others claim it gave the Soviets breathing room to build up arms behind the scenes. What's not up for debate is how fragile it all was. Because just as things seemed to stabilize, Watergate exploded. Nixon resigned in 1974. The American public, already weary from Vietnam and inflation, grew cynical. Gerald Ford stepped in with a good handshake. but bad poll numbers. Meanwhile, the Soviets were watching closely, noting the chaos and the cracks, which brings us to the Helsinki Accords of 1975, another awkward, peace-seeking dinner party, hosted in a neutral country with excellent wool sweaters. 35 countries signed on, including the US, the USSR, and almost all of Europe. The accords promise to respect national borders, uphold human rights, and encourage cooperation. Sounds noble. And yet, the Soviets interpreted it as a win. It acknowledged their post-World War II borders in Eastern Europe. The West, meanwhile, saw it as a backdoor attempt to pry open the Iron Curtain with soft power crowbars like freedom of speech and don't imprison dissidents just because they write poems. And that's where détente started to fray. Back home in the US, critics from both parties began turning on it. Conservatives accused the White House of going soft on communism. Liberals pointed out that human rights were still being stomped on in Soviet satellite states. It was like trying to make peace with a grizzly bear while it's actively eating your picnic basket. And the Soviets, they were getting bold again. They ramped up military support for revolutionary groups in Africa, backed Cuba's intervention in Angola, and tightened their grip on Eastern Europe. Détente had bought time, but not trust. And with the economy crumbling and new leaders rising, the warmth began to chill. By the time the 1980s rolled in, with Ronald Reagan's cowboy rhetoric and Brezhnev wheezing his way through military parades, détente was dead, buried somewhere between a disco ball and a nuclear silo. But for a few surreal years in the 70s, you could almost believe the world had grown tired of conflict. You could believe in peace talks and panda diplomacy, astronaut handshakes, and jazz in Red Square, almost. So you lean back now, lights dimmed, lava lamp still bubbling beside you. Somewhere, deep in a Soviet bunker, a missile quietly hums. Somewhere else, in an American control room, a radar screen blinks lazily. And above it all, the Cold War rolls on, calmer, quieter, but still cold. You're standing in the vast dust bowl of Central Asia, where the wind tastes like sand and regret. The sun is a merciless overseer in a sky so wide it feels like the world's end. And below it, tanks crawl like metal insects through the rocky sprawl of Afghanistan. It's 1979, and the Soviet Union has just wandered into a military tar pit that will cling to its boots for the next decade. You zip your jacket tighter, as if that'll help. But this isn't your war. Not really. You're just watching the slow motion collapse of someone else's grand plan. One that starts with steel confidence and ends in smoke and mountain shadows. The Soviets roll in under the banner of international brotherhood. Read, propping up a fragile communist regime that's busy offending basically everyone in the country. Afghan villagers whisper that Moscow has sent devils, not comrades. And in response, small bands of mujahideen, tribal fighters armed with old rifles, religious zeal, and way too much terrain advantage, start making the Red Army's life very difficult. You trudge along the narrow goat paths, carved into cliff sides, trying not to think about how high up you are, or how easily a rocket-propelled grenade could zip past that next boulder. The mountains don't care who's invading the century. They've seen Persians, Brits, and now Soviets stumble through the same cursed valleys. Mainstream fact? This war would drag on for 9 years, cost the Soviets over 15,000 soldiers, and contribute to the collapse of the USSR itself. But you don't know that yet. Right now, you're just dodging ambushes, rationing canned beets, and questioning every military decision made since Khrushchev's ghost stopped banging his shoe. Quirky tidbit? Some Soviet troops were issued winter hats and cold weather gear in the Afghan summer. Classic bureaucratic oversight. Imagine sprinting through 100-degree FSOR desert heat in full-blown Arctic fur. If the rebels didn't get you, heat stroke probably would. And let's not forget the minefields. The Soviets lay down millions of them, some disguised as toys. You spot a plastic butterfly resting in the dust and realize it's not the kind of thing you want to touch. These toy mines are meant to maim, not kill, in a sinister psychological tactic. The kind that leaves communities limping for decades. You turn toward the sky. Something buzzes far overhead. A drone? Nope. It's an American-made Stinger missile being fired by a mujahid trained with help from, wait for it, the CIA. Yep. Here's where it gets twisty. See, the US sees the Soviet quagmire as an opportunity. You know, Cold War Playbook 101. If they bleed, we win. So Operation Cyclone is born, America's covert, years-long effort to funnel money, training, and weapons to Afghan resistance fighters. That includes shoulder-launched missiles, ammo, and an occasional wink from Langley. You meet a few CIA field agents hanging out in Pakistan, wearing sunglasses and shirts that scream, "I'm totally not a spy." They're passing along crates marked farm equipment. Inside, definitely not tractors. Historians still argue whether this was a strategic masterstroke or a short-sighted mess that later enabled the rise of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. You, standing ankle-deep in helicopter wreckage, aren't so sure. It feels like playing chess with live grenades. By 1986, the tide turns. Those Stinger missiles make Soviet helicopters, once a source of terror, sitting ducks. The Mujahideen film themselves, blowing things up on VHS tapes that circle the globe. The Red Army is now stuck defending isolated outposts, constantly harassed, low on morale, and unsure why they're still here. You pass a Soviet recruit, scribbling in his journal. He's 19, far from home, and convinced no one's reading the propaganda anymore. He just wants to go home to his mom and drink kvass on the balcony. And finally, in 1989, the last Soviet tank crosses the Friendship Bridge back into Uzbekistan. You watch from the ridge as they vanish in the dust. No fanfare, just tired men in dirty uniforms, retreating from the graveyard of empires. The Cold War didn't heat up here. It boiled over and scalded both sides. You've seen how proxy wars work now. It's always someone else's boots on the ground, someone else's blood in the soil. And you're left wondering, was it worth it? You settle down under a rock shelf, eyes scanning the mountains. Afghanistan is quiet for now, but the story here isn't over. It never really is. You're back in the 1980s now, where the Cold War feels like it's running on caffeine, cowboy swagger, and synth music. The world's wearing shoulder pads, mullets, and a thin layer of nuclear anxiety. And right in the middle of it all stands Ronald Reagan, part Hollywood cowboy, part nuclear doomsday prophet, part kindly grandpa, who might just blow up the world if you mess with him before breakfast. You're in Washington, D.C., standing in front of a polished podium with the press packed in tight. Reagan steps up, clears his throat, and in that warm baritone drops the phrase, "The evil empire." He's not talking about a movie. He means the USSR. It's 1983, and Reagan isn't here to play nice. He's not into peaceful coexistence. He wants peace through strength, a phrase that sounds reassuring until you realize it means building enough weapons to destroy the planet twice and hoping no one flinches. You look over the Pentagon budget. It's ballooning like a parade float. Billions for new missiles, stealth bombers, aircraft carriers, submarines with names like USS You Wish You Had This. Meanwhile, NATO is planting Pershing II missiles in Europe like high-tech landmines. The Soviets, panicking, respond with their own arsenal upgrades. You get the distinct feeling the arms race has traded in jogging shoes for rollerblades. Then Reagan drops a new bomb, not literal, but close. The Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI for short. The press immediately dubs it Star Wars. You imagine George Lucas somewhere sighing into his coffee. The idea? Build a space-based missile shield that could shoot down incoming nuclear weapons with lasers and orbiting battle stations. Think satellites with photon cannons, but built by the US government. What could possibly go wrong? You tour an SDI presentation. There are slick renderings of lasers zapping warheads from space like flies. It's all very Buck Rogers meets mutual assured destruction. Scientists murmur that the tech isn't remotely feasible. But that doesn't matter. The Soviets believe it might be real, and that belief alone rattles them. Mainstream fact: SDI never became operational, not even close. But it shifted the psychological game. The USSR had to choose, keep up or fall behind. And keeping up meant spending money it didn't have. Quirky tidbit: some of the research included chemical lasers, X-ray lasers, and an experimental system called Brilliant Pebbles, tiny space-based interceptors meant to smash warheads mid-flight. It sounded like sci-fi. It was sci-fi. But in a Cold War built on perception, sci-fi had value. You're in Moscow now, behind closed Kremlin doors, aging Soviet leaders, weary from Afghanistan and terrified of Reagan's swagger, debate their options. Their economy is a slow-motion collapse. Their tech is lagging. And now, the Americans want to fight wars in space? You picture a Soviet general flipping a table in frustration, or at least angrily adjusting his medals. You fly back to the US, where Reagan is delivering another televised speech. He calls for a world free of nuclear weapons, but does it while authorizing more nuclear weapons. You try to square the contradiction, but your brain throws an error message. And then, just when you think things can't get stranger, Reagan meets Gorbachev. That's right. Mr. Evil Empire himself sits down with a reform-minded Soviet leader in Geneva, 1985. They talk, they laugh, they eat Swiss fondue, and suddenly, everyone's wondering if these two Cold War titans might actually get along. Historians still debate Reagan's legacy. Did he win the Cold War with rhetoric and space lasers that never launched? Or did he just exhaust the USSR until it cracked under the weight of its own ambitions? You stand under a test satellite display. Fake laser mounted for effect, and feel the absurdity of it all. The Cold War is still cold, but it's definitely weirder now. And the finish line? It's closer than anyone realizes. You wake up to sirens. No, not the war kind. Not yet. These are radiation alarms. You're standing in Pripyat, Ukraine, on a cool spring night in April 1986, under a sleepy Soviet sky. All around you are rows of tidy apartment blocks built for nuclear engineers and their families. Modern, sterile, hopeful. Everything about this place is supposed to scream future, and then the reactor explodes. Chernobyl. You flinch at the noise. The ground doesn't shake like a bomb. It's quieter than that. But the sky is not. There's a blue beam slicing upward into the night, brighter than the moon. It's beautiful in a way. You'd never guess it's lethal. You wander through the control room of reactor number 4, where the dials are still glowing red, and the operators are coughing up blood. One engineer is trying to call Moscow. Another is in shock. A third is still insisting the core is intact, even as the graphite fires rage and helicopters begin to swarm. You breathe in and regret it instantly. Mainstream fact: Chernobyl released 400 times more radioactive material than the Hiroshima bomb. It contaminated huge swaths of Europe, forced the evacuation of hundreds of thousands, and exposed deep structural flaws, not just in Soviet engineering, but in the entire communist system of secrecy, denial, and delay. And here's your quirky tidbit. The initial Soviet response was to send in volunteers with shovels and no protective gear, some of whom cleared radioactive debris from the reactor roof for just 90 seconds at a time. They were called biorobots. You meet one. He jokes about how his watch melted before he did. He's 22, already coughing, and doesn't know that decades later, the world will call him a hero. You head to Moscow. It's eerily quiet. Gorbachev doesn't address the public until days later, when the wind has already carried the fallout across borders and into Sweden. Western scientists noticed the radiation before the USSR said a word. Classic Cold War vibes. Say nothing, control the narrative, hope the Geiger counters are wrong. But this time, the truth is harder to bury than nuclear waste. You feel something shift, not just in the ozone, in the system. Suddenly, Soviet citizens aren't just whispering. They're talking, questioning, demanding to know why their children were allowed to play in radioactive rain, why it took over 48 hours to evacuate Pripyat, why lies come faster than ambulances. This is where glasnost gets real. Gorbachev's policy of openness which once felt like a nice idea for Western newspapers, is now being tested by fire and fallout. And for the first time, the USSR can't hide the cracks. They're glowing. Across Eastern Europe, dissent is simmering. You find yourself in Poland, where Solidarity, the independent labor union banned years ago, is surging back like an old song stuck in people's heads. In East Germany, graffiti is blooming on gray walls. Not just slogans, questions, dangerous ones. You sneak across the Hungarian border, where barbed wire fences are being quietly dismantled. That's right. The Iron Curtain is getting a trim. It's still standing, sure, but someone's found the scissors. And yet, back in the Kremlin, the gears are still grinding. Gorbachev is trying to balance reform with control. Perestroika, restructuring, means privatizing bits of the economy, loosening the reins, flirting with capitalism. But it's like trying to unclog a dam with a teaspoon. Everything's jammed, brittle, ready to burst. You read the Pravda newspaper, still full of praise, still hollow as a rusted pipe. But then, on page 4, a real editorial with criticism, you blink. Did someone leave the truth machine running? You talk to a grandmother who remembers Stalin. She says, "I never thought I'd live to see a leader apologize." She's not sure whether to laugh, cry, or start hoarding bread. But even as the cracks widen, the wall still stands. Berlin. It's divided, guarded, brutal as ever. But something's different. You lean on the western side, listening to music pounding from boomboxes. On the other side, the East Germans stare through, curious, restless, their eyes no longer blank, just waiting. The Cold War is still officially on, but unofficially, it's wobbling, wounded. You can feel it, smell it in the radioactive wind, hear it in the soft footsteps of protesters, see it in the sweat beading on Gorbachev's brow every time he tries to juggle change and control. Chernobyl wasn't just a meltdown of a reactor. It was a meltdown of trust. And no concrete wall is strong enough to hold back what's coming next. You close your eyes, still glowing a little from the past few days. Maybe it's time to leave the Geiger counter behind. You're seated at a round table in the Kremlin, sipping tea that's far too hot and far too bitter. Across from you sits Mikhail Gorbachev, the man with the unmistakable birthmark, a slow blink, and an even slower smile. His office is a strange mix of Soviet rigidity and cautious hope. You get the feeling that even the furniture is unsure whether to lean toward Lenin or IKEA. This is a man juggling chainsaws in a wind tunnel. Welcome to Gorbachev's gamble, where every decision either saves the Soviet Union or sets it on fire. And you're in the front row. You start by observing the domestic chaos. Gorbachev's big twin reforms, perestroika, economic restructuring, and glasnost, political openness, are officially in motion. But implementation? That's another story. Factories that used to churn out 5-year plans, like clockwork, are suddenly unsure whether they're supposed to sell to the government, the people, or some guy named Victor with cash. Farmers can technically trade their produce at market rates, but most of them don't know what those are. Supply chains break like old shoelaces. Prices go up. Shelves go bare. You watch a crowd gather outside a bakery in Leningrad. They're not here for fresh loaves. They're here to complain, loudly, publicly, in front of a news camera. That's new. Mainstream fact? Glasnost leads to a flood of political activism, exposés, and open criticism. Newspapers start printing articles about Stalin's crimes, environmental disasters, even, gasp, economic inequality. It's like the whole Soviet Union discovered comment sections overnight. But here's your quirky tidbit. The Soviet government actually launched a hotline for citizens to call in and report their thoughts about the new reforms. It got overwhelmed almost immediately, with people asking everything from, "Why is meat still missing?" to, "Are aliens in charge of the Politburo?" You're pretty sure at least 3 of those calls were from the same old man in Novosibirsk. Outwardly, Gorbachev still plays the confident reformer. He tours factories, smiles for the cameras, and preaches renewal. But in quiet meetings, he's frantic. His advisors squabble. Hardliners accuse him of selling out. Reformers say he's too timid. And the public? They're divided. Some hail him as a hero. Others mutter that he's a repainted Brezhnev with a nicer suit. You drift into a smoky kitchen in Georgia, where a university student is ranting about independence. Not economic independence, full national sovereignty. The Soviet republics, once relatively quiet, are now full of people with old flags, older grudges, and fresh momentum. Gorbachev wanted to reform the Union, not lose it. But the more he opens the door, the more everyone wants to sprint through it. You attend a Communist Party Congress in 1988, where Gorbachev does something unthinkable. He allows open elections. People actually vote. And, surprise, some non-party candidates win. It's the political equivalent of poking a bear to see if it's dead, only to realize it's very much alive and really into democracy now. The debates get fiery. You watch on grainy TV as Andrei Sakharov, the nuclear physicist turned dissident, openly criticizes the war in Afghanistan and calls for more rights. He's not jailed this time. He's applauded. Historians still argue whether Gorbachev was a visionary Democrat or a desperate bureaucrat trying to save a sinking ship. But the ship is definitely taking on water. You shift scenes again. Now you're in Eastern Europe, and the ripple effect of Gorbachev's hands-off approach is visible. Unlike his predecessors, he's not sending in tanks every time a satellite state looks sideways. Hungary begins dismantling its border fences with Austria. Poland's Solidarity Party gets legalized again. And in Czechoslovakia, people are starting to speak in public, like the walls aren't listening anymore. By late 1989, you're standing in East Berlin, where whispers are turning into shouts. And here's the twist. Gorbachev is popular abroad. Western leaders love him. He's Time magazine's Man of the Year twice. Ronald Reagan calls him a man we can do business with. Margaret Thatcher warms to him, as much as Thatcher warms to anyone. Even pop culture can't resist him. There's a Pizza Hut commercial in the near future, with his face on it. Seriously. But at home, things are getting dicey. Food lines stretch longer than train tracks. Ethnic tensions flare in Armenia and Azerbaijan. The Baltic states are demanding a seat at the grown-up table. And all the while, the ruble is collapsing like a cheap lawn chair. You catch a televised address. Gorbachev looks tired, bags under his eyes, hair thinning, voice just a little too soft. He pleads for patience, for unity, for the future. But you know what's coming. It's not just a gamble anymore. It's a countdown. The structure of the Soviet Union, its economy, its ideology, its very reason for existing, is crumbling under the weight of its own contradictions. You can only patch a sinking ship for so long before everyone grabs life jackets. And Gorbachev? He's still bailing water, still smiling for the cameras, still trying to convince the world that the Soviet dream just needs a little remodeling. But you hear it in the streets, in the whispers of old women, in the chants of students, in the slogans spray-painted on party headquarters. The people are dreaming a different dream now, and no one, not even Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, knows how to stop it. You're standing on a graffitied concrete slab. It's night, it's cold, and it smells faintly of cheap beer and fried sausage. Behind you, East Berlin. In front of you, West Berlin. In between, just a wall, tall, ugly, cracked, and, oh yeah, 1,000 shouting people with chisels, hammers, and dreams leaking out of their eyeballs. This is it. November 9th, 1989. The Berlin Wall is about to fall, and you're smack in the middle of the party. Let's rewind a bit. For decades, this slab of reinforced concrete wasn't just a wall. It was the symbol of Cold War division. East versus West, communism versus capitalism, bratwurst versus cheeseburgers. It sliced Berlin in half like a dull knife through a shared history. On one side, neon signs and Levi's jeans. On the other, suspicion and sausage lines. But now, the concrete is cracking, not from bombs or bulldozers, but from people with nothing left to lose. In East Germany, the crowds are growing bolder. Weekly protests in Leipzig go from a few hundred cautious marchers to 70,000 people chanting, "Wir sind das Volk." We are the people. They carry candles, not guns. They chant in harmony, and they refuse to go home. The government is sweating through its polyester suits. Then a press conference blunder. East German official Günther Schabowski fumbles a note, then mumbles something about travel restrictions being lifted, effective immediately. No one, including him, understands what just happened. But Berliners do. They hear one thing. The border is open, and they come, you're shoulder to shoulder, with kids in denim jackets, parents holding toddlers, old men with tears in their mustaches. Someone hands you a hammer. You don't even ask why. You just start swinging. Mainstream fact? The Berlin Wall didn't fall because of a grand agreement or a nuclear standoff. It fell because confused bureaucrats, fearless citizens, and raw momentum collided at exactly the right moment. Quirky fact? One guy, true story, brought a garden pickaxe to the wall. He spent the whole night chipping away while drinking warm cola and shouting at the guards, who, by that point, looked like they wanted to go home as badly as he did. Some guards just opened the gates. No shots fired. No orders received. Just a shrug. A surrender to history. You dance on the wall's ruins. West Berliners hug their Eastern cousins. Strangers kiss. Bands show up. David Hasselhoff sings. Yes, David Hasselhoff. In a light-up jacket. This is not a fever dream. The Cold War, once a hushed nightmare, now feels like a bad sitcom that finally got cancelled. And it doesn't stop with Berlin. You blink and you're in Prague, watching the Velvet Revolution turn Czechoslovakia peaceful and proud. Then Bucharest, where Romania's dictator Ceausescu flees a crowd, only to be captured and executed on Christmas Day. Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria. They all topple like dominoes with a mild head cold. The Eastern Bloc is dissolving in real time, and you're chasing the echoes across every border. Back in Moscow, Gorbachev watches the news with a forced smile and white knuckles. He wanted reform, not collapse. Openness, not disintegration. But history, you realize, is like spilled ink. You can't shape the stains once they spread. The great Cold War debate. Historians still argue whether the wall fell because of Gorbachev's reforms, Western pressure, or the sheer will of the people on the street. Maybe it was all three. Maybe the wall was doomed the moment someone spray-painted freedom on it in 6 languages. By Christmas Eve, 1989, you stand on a patch of former no man's land with a warm beer in your hand. Behind you, a band plays a clunky rendition of Beethoven's Ode to Joy. Ahead, people walk freely through what used to be Sniper Alley. For the first time in a long time, Berlin is one city, one voice, one beat. You feel it in your bones. The Cold War is no longer cold. It's just ending, one stone at a time. It's December 25th, 1991, Christmas Day. But instead of tearing into wrapping paper or burning your fingers on fresh out the oven cinnamon rolls, you're watching TV. And what's on? Not Home Alone, not the Queen's Speech, not even a rerun of Matlock. It's Mikhail Gorbachev, alone in a room, resigning. He adjusts his glasses, clears his throat, and calmly announces that the Soviet Union no longer exists. He folds the speech, stands up, and exits stage left. Quiet, polite, tragic. The hammer and sickle flag that once loomed over half the globe, lowered, replaced by the red, white, and blue of a new Russian Federation. You're still holding your cup of eggnog, wondering, wait, did we just win? Let's rewind, because Cold Wars don't end like movies. There's no final boss fight, no Eiffel Tower explosion, no orchestral swell, just a slow-motion pileup of debt, disillusionment, and accidental freedom. Here's the short version. The USSR's economy is wheezing like a broken accordion. Its empire of satellite states, defecting faster than a KGB agent, with a conscience. Gorbachev's reforms, glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, were meant to fix things. Instead, they pulled the curtain back on decades of dysfunction, and the people, fed up, broke, ready for something, anything else. So by 1991, the Soviet Union isn't so much a superpower as a loose confederation of republics trying to ghost each other. One by one, they break up with Moscow. Ukraine votes for independence. The Baltics walk out like cool kids at a bad party. Even Kazakhstan grabs its coat and quietly slips out the back. By December, 15 republics are gone, and Gorbachev, left with no union to preside over. Mainstream fact. On Christmas Day, 1991, the Cold War officially ends. Not with nuclear winter, but with a fax machine in the Kremlin confirming the USSR's self-dissolution. Quirky fact? When the Soviet flag came down over the Kremlin, the American news anchors didn't know what to do. One network played "God Bless America" over B-roll of Red Square. Another one just cut to commercials for fruitcake and VCRs. Ongoing historical debate. Did America win the Cold War? Or did the Soviet Union just lose? Because yes, the US came out on top, but it wasn't just Reagan's speeches and NATO expansion. It was oil prices, bad planning, nationalism, and that ever-present Soviet knack for spending more money on missiles than milk. So what's left? You've got a Russia trying to figure out what kind of country it wants to be. A United States dancing awkwardly on the world stage with no real rival, just a hangover and a big defense budget. And former Soviet republics learning how to spell democracy while surviving on instant noodles and IMF loans. But here's the thing. The Cold War may have ended, sort of, because the nukes, still here. The spies, still lurking. The paranoia, just updated for new software and new players. China, cyber warfare, artificial intelligence, resource battles have stepped into the ring. It's not Cold War 2.0 exactly, but the tension never really left the room. You can change the calendar, you can drop the Iron Curtain, but history likes to echo. You turn off the TV, Gorbachev's gone, the Soviet Union is gone, but the world still spinning, still complicated, still beautifully, frustratingly human. So you pull a blanket over your legs, close your eyes, and let the Cold War drift quietly into the archives, messy, surreal, and unforgettable. Good night, comrade.